The Grand Master's private chapel smelled not of frankincense or beeswax, but of the copper tang of fresh blood and the ozone of a dying fire. Sir Aristhène stood over the man he had called brother for 20 years, his white mantle stained with a Rorschach blot of crimson that mocked the red cross stitched over his heart. Outside, the bells of Paris tolled for vespers, a peaceful sound that belied the fact that by dawn the most powerful military order in Christendom would be reduced to ash, and the men within this room would be the fuel. The silence that followed the struggle was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Aristhène's lungs. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, a warrior's hands, but they felt detached from his soul. Beneath him, Thomas, a man who had survived the blistering heat of Acre and the freezing winds of the Cypriot coast, lay dead. Thomas had not been a traitor to the Order, but he had been a traitor to the secret, and in the shadow world of the Black Knights, the distinction was a death sentence. "Forgive me," Aristhène whispered, though he knew the words were hollow. There was no one left in this sanctuary to grant absolution. He turned his attention to the stone altar. It was a massive, unadorned slab of granite that had seen centuries of prayer. To any visiting bishop or secular lord, it was a symbol of Templar piety. To the few who wore the obsidian ring beneath their mail gloves, it was a lid. Aristhène reached into the collar of his tunic and pulled out a heavy iron key, its teeth worn smooth by generations of nervous fingers. The mechanism groaned as he engaged the hidden lock at the base of the altar. With a sound like grinding teeth, a section of the floor slid back, revealing a narrow spiral staircase that descended into the damp bowels of the Paris temple. This was the Black Archive, a place that did not exist in the king's ledgers or the pope's mandates. It was the repository of the uncomfortable truths the order had unearthed in the Levant. Parchments that suggested the foundations of the church were built on sand rather than rock. As he descended, the air grew colder, smelling of saltpeter and ancient dust. He carried a single tallow candle, its flame dancing wildly in the draught. At the bottom of the stairs sat a lead-lined casket, no larger than a footlocker. It was unremarkable to the eye, yet it was the reason King Philip the Fair had spent months poisoning the mind of Pope Clement. It was the reason the iron hounds of the Royal Guard were currently sharpening their blades in the barracks across the Seine. Aristhène placed his hand on the casket. He could feel the vibration of the city above, the rumble of carts, the distant shouts of merchants, the oblivious pulse of a kingdom about to commit a grand atrocity. He had been briefed by Jacques de Molay only hours before. The Grand Master had looked aged, his eyes sunken into a face that seemed carved from grey parchment. "They are coming, Aristhène," de Molay said, his voice a dry rasp. "They are not coming for the gold. Philip has spent the gold already in his mind. They are coming for the veritatem. If the king gains the archive, he does not just destroy the order, he gains the power to unmake the world. You are the last of the Black Knights. You must become a ghost." The memory of the Grand Master's desperation fueled Aristhène's movements. He hauled the casket from its niche. It was deceptively heavy, the weight of 100 dead men. He knew the plan. He was to take the subterranean tunnels that led to the banks of the river, where a barge waited to ferry him toward the coast. From there, the trail would lead to the shadows of the Jura Mountains, and eventually, if God was merciful, to the edges of the known world. But God, Aristhène reflected, had been remarkably silent of late. A sudden, sharp, metallic clang echoed down the staircase. It wasn't the sound of a falling tool or a settling stone. It was the unmistakable ring of a sword hilt striking a stone wall. Above, in the chapel, the heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges. "In the name of the king," a voice bellowed, muffled by the depth but unmistakable in its authority. "By order of the Holy Inquisition, open these doors." Aristhène blew out his candle. Darkness swallowed him, absolute and suffocating. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the Aristhène archive, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The arrests had begun early. The king had moved before the appointed hour, hoping to catch the Templars in their beds. He heard the heavy boots of soldiers entering the chapel above.
He heard the gasps as they discovered Thomas's body. The secret passage was well hidden, but it would not hold against a determined search. He had minutes, perhaps only seconds, before they found the mechanism. He gripped the handle of the lead-lined casket. His mission was no longer about the glory of the temple or the defense of the Holy Land. It was about survival, not of his life, but of the secret he carried. If he failed, the blood on his hands and the fire in the streets would be for nothing. He began to move through the pitch-black tunnel, navigating by touch and memory. Every scrape of his boots sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space. Behind him, he heard the grind of the altar moving. The hunters were in the burrow. Aristhène did not look back. He stepped into the damp, lightless void, a knight of a fallen order, carrying the weight of a truth that could burn the world to the ground.
The Palais de la Cité sat like a brooding stone predator overlooking the Seine, its windows flickering with the orange light of 1,000 candles that refused to sleep. Inside the Hall of Guards, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment, cold iron, and the sharp, acidic tang of ink. King Philip IV, known to history as the Fair for his handsome, frozen features, did not look like a man orchestrating the collapse of a holy empire. He looked like an accountant. He sat hunched over a massive oak table strewn with ledgers, his pale eyes tracking columns of numbers that refused to balance. To his left stood Guillaume de Nogaret, a man whose soul seemed composed entirely of shadow and statecraft, his fingers stained black from a lifetime of writing death warrants. "The arrests began at prime, sire," Nogaret said, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp that cut through the scratching of the king's quill. "By dawn, every Templar preceptory from Paris to Marseille will be under royal seal. The Pope's hesitation was a minor hurdle. The threat of heresy is a flame that consumes even the most reluctant pontiff." Philippe did not look up. He was staring at a specific entry in the Grand Master's ledger, a gap in the finances that had haunted his sleep for 3 years. "The gold, Guillaume. Tell me of the gold. My creditors in Lombardy do not accept heresy as a form of payment." "The gold is being tallied, but there is a discrepancy," Nogaret admitted, his posture stiffening. "The treasury at the Paris temple was lighter than our spies suggested. We found the ceremonial plate and the tithes from the northern commanderies, but the central reserve, the legendary bullion of the Levant, remains unaccounted for." Philippe finally raised his head. His face was a mask of aristocratic calm, but his eyes held a terrifying cold fire. "I did not risk the wrath of God and the excommunication of the Church to seize a few silver chalices and some dusty tapestries. The Templars have functioned as the bankers of the world because they possess the world's collateral. If that collateral is gone, Nogaret, then I am merely a thief in a crown." "It is not just the gold that is missing, sire," Nogaret countered, stepping closer into the circle of candlelight. "The Black Archive. Our informants within the order spoke of a specific collection of documents, records older than the Merovingian kings, scrolls recovered from beneath the Temple Mount. My men broke into the Grand Master's private chapel an hour ago. They found a dead knight on the floor, his throat opened by a brother's blade, and they found an empty vault beneath the altar." Philippe stood slowly, his velvet robes whispering against the floor. The silence in the room became absolute. The guards at the door held their breath, knowing that Philippe's silence was more dangerous than his shouting. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the temple fortress across the river. Somewhere in those shadows, his soldiers were dragging men in white mantles into the street, but the prize he truly craved was slipping through his fingers like water. "A dead knight killed by his own," Philippe mused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Black Knights, the order within the order. De Molay has deployed his ghosts." "They cannot have gone far," Nogaret insisted. "I have closed the city gates. No one leaves Paris without a royal signet. I have dispatched the Iron Hounds, my most loyal inquisitorial trackers, to scour the sewers and the riverbanks. If a rat tries to crawl out of the temple, they will catch it."
"You underestimate the desperation of men who believe they are guarding the truth of God," Philippe said, turning back to the table. He picked up a heavy, iron-bound ledger and slammed it shut, the sound echoing like a coffin lid. "The gold is secondary, Nogaret. If those records reach the hands of my enemies, if they reach the common folk or the rival courts of Europe, the divine right of my bloodline is nothing more than a bedtime story. I want that casket. I want the man carrying it. I want him broken until he begs for the fire." Nogaret bowed low, his face obscured by the flickering shadows. "It will be done, sire. We have already begun the interrogations of the younger knights. Terror is a remarkable lubricant for the memory. By noon, we will have a name. By dusk, we will have a trail." "See that you do," Philippe said, returning to his chair. He picked up his quill again, but his hand trembled slightly, a rare fracture in his icy composure. "The Templars have survived for 200 years because they are a shadow. To kill a shadow, you must bring it into the blinding light. Burn the city if you must, but bring me the archive." Outside, the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the Parisian sky. The bells of the city, which usually signaled the start of a new day of commerce and prayer, now rang with a frantic, discordant rhythm. The Great Purge had begun. In the streets, the clatter of armored horses and the screams of men being dragged from their sanctuaries created a symphony of chaos. Philippe ignored the noise. He stared at the blank space in his ledger, the empty hole where his kingdom's debt was supposed to be erased. He knew that history would remember this day as a triumph of the crown over a corrupt order of warrior monks. But as the sun rose over the Seine, reflecting off the ripples of the dark water, the king felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He was the most powerful man in Christendom, yet he was being outmaneuvered by a ghost in a blood-stained mantle. Deep in the bowels of the palace, Nogaret's clerks were already preparing the lists of the accused. The charges were ready: spitting on the cross, idol worship, secret rites in the dark. The world would believe what the king told them to believe, for the king held the power of the sword and the law. But as Nogaret walked towards the dungeons to begin his grim work, he thought of the empty vault beneath the chapel altar. He knew that truth was far more dangerous currency than gold, and somewhere in the labyrinth of Paris that truth was moving, carried by a man who had already proven he was willing to kill his own brother to keep it hidden. The hunt was no longer about heresy or debt. It was a race for the very soul of the West, and the Iron Hounds were hungry. "Find him," Nogaret whispered to the captain of his guard as they descended into the darkness of the cells, "and do not bring him alive if the casket is not in his hands. The fire awaits anyone who fails me today."
The sewers of Paris were a digestive tract of stone and filth, a labyrinthine nightmare that mirrored the corruption of the world above. Aristhène waded through knee-deep sludge, the lead-lined casket strapped to his back with leather webbing that cut into his shoulders like a penance. The air was a thick, physical presence, smelling of rot and the metallic tang of urban runoff. Above him, through the iron grates of the street level, the world was screaming. He could hear the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of horses galloping over cobblestones and the discordant clanging of bells that signaled the death of his order. He stopped, pressing his back against the slime-slicked wall of the tunnel, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The weight of the archive was not merely physical, it was the weight of every secret the Templars had guarded since the first 9 knights dug beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Inside that box lay the Veritatem, documents that didn't just challenge the Church's history, but threatened the very foundations of the feudal contract. If King Philip's men laid hands on this, they wouldn't just burn the knights, they would rewrite the past to ensure no one ever questioned the crown again. A splash echoed from the junction behind him. It was a deliberate, heavy sound, the sound of a boot hitting water. Aristhène reached for the hilt of his sword, then hesitated. A blade was useless in these cramped, lightless tunnels. Instead, he drew a long, triangular misery cord, a mercy dagger designed to find the gaps in a man's armor. He
He extinguished his small lantern, plunging his world into a blackness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. He waited, letting his other senses take over. The intruder was close. He could hear the rasp of chainmail rubbing against a surcoat and the wet, heavy breathing of someone unaccustomed to the stench of the pits. Then a voice, hushed but urgent, cut through the gloom. "The lion seeks the lamb in the garden of salt." Aristhène froze. It was the countersign of the Black Knights, a phrase known to fewer than 12 men in all of France. He didn't relax his grip on the dagger. "The lamb finds no rest where the wolves wear the mitre," he hissed back. A faint light flickered as a shuttered lantern was cracked open a sliver. The light revealed a face Aristhène recognized, Brother Elias, a younger knight who served as the Order's primary archivist. His white mantle was shredded, and his face was smeared with soot and blood. "Aristhène," Elias gasped, nearly collapsing into the foul water. "They're everywhere. Nogueret's iron hounds. They have dogs, not just bloodhounds, but men who can smell a secret through a stone wall. They've already taken the southern exits." "And the Grand Master?" Aristhène asked, his voice cold. "Seized. He didn't even draw his sword. He stood in the center of the courtyard and let them chain him like a common thief." Elias looked at the casket on Aristhène's back, his eyes widening. "Is that it? The archive?" "It is a burden you should be glad you do not carry," Aristhène replied, his tone softening only slightly. "We have to move. If the southern exits are blocked, we head for the Seine. There is a drainage pipe near the Pont au Change. It's narrow, but it leads to the riverbank where the barge should be waiting." "The river is crawling with royal archers," Elias whispered, shaking his head. "They're searching every boat. Philippe isn't just looking for knights, he's looking for cargo." "Then we don't use the barge," Aristhène said, his mind racing through the tactical maps he had memorized years ago. "We cross the river through the old Roman foundations. There's a submerged passage that connects the temple's lower cellars to a safe house in the Latin Quarter. It's flooded, but it's the only way we won't be seen." As they began to move, the sounds from above grew more frantic. They heard the screams of women and the crashing of doors. The king's decree wasn't just targeting the knights, it was a scorched earth policy against anyone associated with the temple. Aristhène felt a surge of cold fury. He had spent his life defending the faith, spilling his blood in the dust of the Levant for a church that was now turning its back on them to appease a bankrupt king. They reached the junction where the sewer met the Roman stonework. The architecture shifted from rough-hewn blocks to precisely laid ancient brick. The water here was deeper, colder, and stagnant. "Elias, take the lantern," Aristhène commanded. "Keep it low. If you see the water start to ripple, it means the tide is coming in, or someone is opening a sluice gate above us." They waded deeper into the ancient passage. The ceiling dipped lower and lower until they were forced to crouch, the archive scraping against the roof with a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Suddenly, Elias stopped. He raised the lantern, the weak light illuminating a series of marks carved into the stone at eye level. They were Templar symbols, but not the standard cross. These were the sigils of the Black Knights, a closed eye, a broken key, and a serpent eating its own tail. "Someone was here," Elias whispered. "Recently. The moss has been scraped away." Aristhène moved past him, examining the marks. His heart sank. These weren't just sigils, they were a warning. The serpent was carved upside down. Betrayal from within. Before he could speak, a sharp whistle echoed from the tunnel ahead. It was answered by a splash from the tunnel behind them. They were caught in a pincer. "Drop the light!" Aristhène yelled. He spun around, drawing his sword just as a crossbolt hissed through the air, clattering off the stone where Elias's head had been a second before. From the darkness emerged 4 figures in black leather brigandines, Nogueret's iron hounds. They didn't carry the banners of the king. They carried short, heavy blades designed for killing in close quarters. "Give us the box, knight," the lead tracker growled, his voice echoing in the confined space, "and perhaps the king will let you die in a cell instead of on a pyre." Aristhène shifted his weight, feeling the heavy pull of the archive on his back. He looked at Elias, who was trembling, his hand hovering over his own sword. He knew they couldn't win a sustained fight in the water. He needed a distraction. "The box contains nothing but the sins of your masters," Aristhène said, his voice steady spite the adrenaline coursing through him. If you want it, come and claim it from the deep. With a sudden, violent movement, Aristhène kicked a loose pile of debris toward the attackers and lunged forward. He wasn't aiming for the men, he was aiming for the wooden supports that held up a crumbling section of the Roman ceiling. His heavy broadsword bit into the rotten timber with a satisfying crack. As the stone began to groan and shift, Aristhène grabbed Elias by the collar and dove into the dark, rising water of the flooded passage. Behind them, the tunnel collapsed in a roar of silt and ancient masonry, swallowing the light and the screams of the king's men. They were underwater, the weight of the archive pulling Aristhène down into the freezing muck. He kicked frantically, his lungs burning, searching for the opening that led to the river. Just as his vision began to blur into gray, his head broke the surface. He wasn't in the river. He was in a small, damp cellar, the air smelling of old wine and wet earth. A single candle flickered on a table. Sitting there, waiting for them, with a crossbow leveled at Aristhène's chest, was a man wearing the robes of a priest, but the eyes of a soldier. "You're late, Aristhène," the priest said. "The king has already promised 10,000 gold florins for your head, and twice that for what's on your back."
The cellar was a cramped, vaulted womb of limestone, dripping with the sweat of the city. Aristhène stood dripping in the center of the room, the foul sewer water pooling around his boots. His lungs still burned from the swim, and the lead-lined casket felt like a tombstone strapped to his spine. Opposite him, the priest, Father Bernard, a man who had once been a formidable tactician for the order before taking the tonsure, did not lower the crossbow. The bolt was leveled directly at Aristhène's throat. "You speak of gold, Bernard?" Aristhène rasped, his hand still hovering near the hilt of his dripping sword. "Since when does a brother of the temple count the king's florins?" "The temple is dead, Aristhène," Bernard replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "While you were swimming through filth, I watched from the belfry of Saint-Germain. They are dragging the brothers out in chains. Not just the knights, but the cooks, the grooms, the elderly scholars. Nogaret has a list. Your name is at the top, followed by a description of that very box." Brother Elias scrambled out of the water behind Aristhène, coughing and shivering. "He's a brother, Bernard. We have the archive. We need to move." "The archive is the reason they are dying," Bernard said. His eyes flicked to Elias and then back to Aristhène. "Nogaret offered a bargain, the lives of 50 young squires in exchange for the black casket. If I hand it over, those boys go to the frontier instead of the stake. What is more precious, Aristhène, a pile of moldering parchment or the living blood of the order?" The air in the cellar turned frigid. This was the silver trap, the moment where the king's cruelty met the Templars' sense of sacrifice. Philip IV didn't just want the secret, he wanted the knights to destroy themselves to protect it. "The blood of the order is in that box," Aristhène said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. "The men dying in the streets know the price of their oath. If you give Philip those records, you give him the power to erase everything they died for. You give him the power to make their sacrifice a footnote in a liar's history." "The boys are innocent," Bernard shouted, the crossbow trembling slightly. "None of us are innocent," Aristhène countered. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You know what is in here. You were there in the Levant when we pulled the scrolls from the dark. You saw the letters. If the king proves the church is a fabrication of Roman politics, he becomes the sole arbiter of God on earth. There will be no sanctuary left, not for the squires, not for you, not for anyone." Bernard's finger tightened on the trigger. Elias let out a whimper of terror. "I can't let them burn, Aristhène," Bernard whispered. "Then help me take this to La Rochelle," Aristhène commanded. "If we reach the fleet, we can disappear. We can preserve the truth until a day comes when the world is strong enough to hear it. But if you fire that bolt, you are simply Nogaret's executioner." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drip of water and the distant muffled roar of the Paris mob. Then, with a heavy sigh, Bernard lowered the crossbow and leaned it against the wine casks. He looked smaller, the fire of his conviction extinguished by the cold reality of their ruin. "The gates are closed," Bernard said, his voice hollow.
But the silversmiths have a passage. They smuggle bullion past the tax collectors through the old Roman wall near the gate of St. Martin. It's a narrow crawl, but it bypasses the main guard. Lead the way, Aristhène said, though he did not sheathe his dagger. They moved out of the cellar and into the narrow, winding alleys of the Latin Quarter. Paris was a city under siege by its own king. Torches flared at every corner, and the shadows of the iron hounds stretched long and jagged against the timber-framed houses. Aristhène kept his white mantle hooded, the red cross hidden beneath a muddy traveler's cloak. As they neared the gate of St. Martin, the smell of wood smoke grew stronger. It wasn't from hearths. In the distance, near the center of the city, a large pyre was being constructed. The king wasn't waiting for trials. He was building a stage for his final act. There, Bernard whispered, pointing to a low, unassuming stone archway hidden behind a stack of tanning hides. The passage is behind the third loose stone, but as they approached, the shadows moved. From the darkness of the archway stepped a man in polished black plate armor, his surcoat bearing the royal lilies of France. Behind him, a dozen archers rose from the rooftops like crows. "Sir Aristhène," the knight in black said, drawing a heavy longsword, "I am Captain Marceau of the Iron Hounds. I believe you have something that belongs to the crown." Aristhène spun around looking for an exit, but the alley was already blocked. He looked at Bernard, expecting to see guilt, but Bernard looked just as horrified. "I didn't tell them," Bernard gasped. "I swear." "You didn't have to," Marceau said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "The silver trap isn't just a bargain, Father. It's a tracking method. We knew you'd lead to the biggest rat in the nest." The archers notched their arrows. Aristhène felt the weight of the archive on his back, a heavy leaden anchor. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped in a dead-end alley while the city of Paris burned around him. This was the end of the setup. The inciting incident was over. The flight was no longer a secret, it was a war. "Elias, get behind the stone," Aristhène ordered, drawing his broadsword. The steel sang as it left the scabbard, a silver spark in the gloom. "Bernard, if you still want to save those boys, find your courage." Marceau raised his hand. "Kill the priest and the boy. Bring me the knight and the box alive. The king wants to watch him bleed." As the first volley of arrows hissed through the air, Aristhène threw himself forward, not towards the exit, but towards the enemy. He was a black knight, a shadow of the Templar, and if he was to fall, he would ensure the king's men paid for the secret in blood. The scream of the first dying man echoed through the alley, marking the official beginning of the Great Flight. Act 1 had closed in fire and betrayal. The road to the coast was now a trail of corpses.
The French countryside was no longer a realm of rolling vineyards and pious hamlets. It had become a vast, open-air cage. 2 weeks had passed since the blood-slicked alleys of Paris, and the world had shrunk to the rhythm of labored breathing and the rhythmic thud of hooves on damp earth. Aristhène, Elias, and a badly wounded Father Bernard moved through the dense thickets of the Orléans forest, keeping to the shadows of the ancient oaks. The autumn air was sharpening into a blade, and the scent of damp decay rose from the forest floor to meet the cold sweat of the fugitives. Behind them, the Iron Hounds were no longer a distant threat, but a constant, baying presence. Guillaume de Nogaret had not sent mere soldiers. He had deployed his inquisitorial trackers, men trained to read the bent of a blade of grass and the lingering heat of a campfire. These hunters did not sleep, and they did not tire. They were the physical manifestation of the king's obsession, fueled by the promise of titles and the fear of the rack. "We cannot keep this pace," whispered Elias, his face a ghostly mask of exhaustion. He was leading their remaining horse, a ragged bay that carried the weight of the lead-lined casket. The animal's breath came in white plumes, its flanks quivering with every step. Bernard's fever is worsening. The arrow wound in his side has turned the color of bruised plums. Aristhène stopped, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He scanned the tree line, his eyes narrow and predatory. He had shed his white mantle days ago, burying the iconic garment in a shallow grave to hide their trail. Now he wore the blackened leather and rough wool of a common mercenary.
but the way he carried himself, the stillness of a coiled spring, betrayed his high-born martial training. "We stop at the ruins of the Voreux Chapel," Aristhène decided, gesturing toward a crumbling stone silhouette on a distant ridge. "It is a hollow shell, but it offers a vantage point. If we are to be caught, I would rather see them coming than be taken in our sleep." They reached the ruins as the sun began to sink, casting long skeletal shadows across the valley. The chapel had been abandoned during the Bled riots years prior, its roof caved in and its altar defiled by travelers and moss. It was a fitting sanctuary for the last of the Black Knights, a broken monument to a fading age. As Elias tended to the horse and Bernard slumped against a wall in a delirious haze, Aristhène unstrapped the casket. He set it down with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. He stared at the lead seal, his mind wandering back to the secrets it contained. He knew the contents by heart, having studied the transcripts in the secret vaults of Cyprus. They were the chronicles of the Nazarene, letters exchanged between Roman administrators that suggested the early church had suppressed the true, more human lineage of the prophet to bolster the divine authority of the Roman See. If Philip IV possessed these, he could blackmail the Pope into dissolving the French crown's debts, or worse, declare himself the new, purified head of a nationalized church. The stakes were not just the survival of the Templars, but the stability of the entire social order of Europe. "Aristhène," Bernard croaked from the corner, his eyes fluttering open. "The water, it tastes of iron." Aristhène knelt beside the priest, offering a water skin. Bernard's skin was hot to the touch, the infection spreading through his blood. "Rest, father. We reach the Loire tomorrow. Once we cross, the terrain favors us." You should have left me in Paris," Bernard whispered, clutching Aristhène's forearm with a strength born of panic. "The Hounds, they have a tracker named Valerius. He was one of us once, a brother who broke under Nogaret's questioning. He knows our tactics. He knows how you think." Aristhène felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Valerius. He remembered the man, a brilliant scout who had been captured in a skirmish near Lyon. If Valerius was leading the pursuit, then every trick Aristhène had used, the doubling back, the water walking, the false trails, was being unraveled in real time. "He won't catch us," Bernard said, though the lie felt heavy in his mouth. A low, mournful howl echoed from the valley below. It wasn't a wolf. It was the signal of a hunting horn, its note flat and metallic. The hounds had found the ridge. "They're here," Elias gasped, clutching a rusted pitchfork he had found in the ruins. "How? We traveled through the stream for 3 miles." "Valerius," Aristhène hissed. He stood up, drawing his sword. The steel caught the last red rays of the sun, looking as though it had been dipped in wine. "Elias, take the casket. There is a cellar drop behind the altar. Get inside and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" "I am going to remind Valerius what happens to brothers who forget their oaths." The first of the hounds appeared at the edge of the clearing, 3 men on foot, moving with the silent efficiency of professional killers. They wore dark gambesons and heavy crossbows. Behind them, a tall, gaunt figure on a black horse emerged from the mist. The rider's face was hooded, but the way he sat in the saddle, rigid and precise, was unmistakable. "Aristhène," Valerius called out, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "Give us the archive and the boy. The king's mercy is a narrow gate, but I can still hold it open for you. Think of the brothers in the dungeons. Every hour you run, another 10 are put to the question." Aristhène stepped out of the chapel's arched doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. He stood alone, a shadow against the gray stone. "The king has no mercy, Valerius. He has only hunger, and you are nothing but a scrap thrown from his table." "I am a survivor," Valerius shouted back, his hand signaling the archers to spread out. "The order was a lie we told ourselves to feel like more than killers. Philippe is the only truth left in France." "Then come and witness the truth," Aristhène said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. He didn't wait for the charge. He sprinted toward the tree line, using the uneven ground for cover. Crossbow bolts hissed past him, thudding into the ancient wood of the chapel doors. He disappeared into the brush, becoming a ghost once more. In the chapel, Elias huddled in the dark, his arms wrapped around the cold lead of the casket. He listened to the screams of men in the forest, the sharp, sudden cries that ended in a gurgle. He heard the clash of steel and the heavy breathing of a predator. But as the moon rose, a new sound began to filter into the ruins, a low, rhythmic chanting. Bernard had sat up in his delirium, his voice rasping out an old Latin prayer for the dead. It was a beacon in the night, a sound that would lead the hounds straight to the archive. Elias looked at the casket, then at the dying priest. He realized then that the Black Knights were not just protectors of a secret, they were the secret's first victims. The weight of the world was in his hands, and the darkness was closing in.
The rain in the Jura foothills did not fall. It drifted in heavy, suffocating curtains of gray, turning the mountain paths into treacherous slides of shale and mud. They had survived the skirmish at the Vauru Chapel, but the cost was etched into their faces. Father Bernard was a ghost held together by sheer will, draped across the back of their sole surviving horse. Aristhène and Elias moved on foot, their boots waterlogged and their spirits frayed to the snapping point. The lead-lined casket, now lashed to a makeshift travois pulled by the horse, dragged through the muck with a persistent rhythmic scraping that sounded to Aristhène like a countdown. The tension within their small group had fermented into something foul. Hunger and the constant shadow of the iron hounds had stripped away the veneer of holy brotherhood, leaving only raw, jagged nerves. "We should have gone to the coast," Elias snapped, his voice cracking with exhaustion. He stopped in the middle of the narrow path, his chest heaving. La Rochelle was the plan. We could be on a ship now, Aristhène. We could be halfway to Scotland or Portugal. Instead, we're climbing into a stone trap. Aristhène turned, his eyes hard and cold as the mountain rain. "The fleet is ash, Elias, I told you. Nogaret's skies were in the harbors before the first arrest was made. To go to the coast was to walk into a noose. Here in the mountains the terrain is our only ally. An ally that is starving us." Elias gestured wildly at the casket. "Look at it. We are dying for a box of old vellum. Father Bernard is rotting before our eyes. And for what? A secret that no one will ever hear? If we took even one of the gold seals from the Grand Master's documents, we could buy a passage, buy food, buy a life." Aristhène stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The movement was instinctive, a warning from a man who had seen too many betrayals in the desert sands of the East. "You aren't a knight anymore, Aristhène. You're just a jailer for a dead god." They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the limestone cliffside. As the sun set, providing no warmth, only a deepening of the gloom, Aristhène set about the grim business of survival. He did not light a fire. The smoke would be a beacon for Valerius and his hounds. They ate strips of dried, salt-cured meat that tasted of dust and despair. In the corner of the cave, Father Bernard's breathing had become a wet, labored rattle. Aristhène knelt by him, cleaning the priest's wound with the last of their wine. The infection had redlined up Bernard's torso, a map of his approaching end. "Aristhène," Bernard whispered, his eyes unfocused. "The boy, keep a watch. The boy's heart is small. He's tired, Father. We all are." "No," Bernard coughed, a spray of dark blood flecking his lips. "In the chapel, before the hounds arrived, I saw him. He wasn't praying. He was scratching marks into the stone, marks that didn't belong to us." Aristhène's blood ran cold. He looked over his shoulder. Elias was huddled near the mouth of the cave, his back to them, staring out into the rain. He looked like a frightened youth, but Aristhène knew that in the world of high stakes, innocence was often the best disguise. Aristhène stood and walked toward the horse and the travois. He began to inspect the leather straps holding the casket. Hidden beneath the thickest fold of the harness, he found it. A small silver coin, a French denier, wedged into the buckle. It was a marker, a way for a tracker to identify a specific horse's hoofprints or to leave a scent for a dog. More damningly, he found a scrap of parchment tucked into the boy's own bedroll. It was a rough map of their route, with the Jura circled in charcoal. The betrayal was not a sudden impulse born of fear. It was a cold, calculated bargain. "How much did they promise you, Elias?" His voice was a low, dangerous growl that cut through the sound of the rain. Elias froze. He didn't turn around immediately.
When he did, his face was no longer that of a trembling squire. It was hard, etched with a bitter, worldly pragmatism. He held a small, concealed dagger in his hand, not a knight's weapon, but a thief's. "A full pardon," Elias said, his voice steady, "and a position in the king's chancellery. My family is in debt, Elias. My sisters will be on the streets because of this order's holy poverty. Why should we all burn for a lie? Nogaret explained it to me months ago. The order was always going to fall. I just chose to be on the side that survives." "You were a black knight," Aristhène said, his heart a hollow chamber of fury. "You swore an oath on the very archive you were trying to sell." "An oath to a shadow," Elias lunged, surprisingly fast. Aristhène didn't draw his sword. The space was too cramped. He caught Elias's wrist, twisting it until the bone groaned. He slammed the boy against the cave wall, his forearm pressed against Elias's throat. "I should kill you where you stand," Aristhène hissed. "Go ahead," Elias choked out, a cruel smile touching his lips. "It won't matter. The signal is already sent. I left the trail of deniers every mile since the forest. Valerius is less than an hour behind us. If you kill me, you're just a lone man with a heavy box and a dead priest. You'll never make the pass." A sharp, high whistle echoed from the slope below, piercing the rhythm of the storm. It was the call of a hunting hawk, the signature signal of the Iron Hounds. Aristhène looked at the boy, then at the dying priest. He felt the crushing weight of the archive, the legacy of thousands of men, and the cold reality of the Judas at his throat. He had a choice, execution or escape. But as the first torchlight flickered on the rocks below, he realized he could no longer do both. "You want to survive, Elias?" Aristhène whispered, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "Then you will help me move this casket one last time, because if the Hounds find us before we reach the crest, I will ensure you are the first one they find, tethered to the archive like a goat for the slaughter." He threw the boy toward the horse. The hunt was no longer just a chase, it was a race against a betrayal that had already taken root.
The rain had turned to sleet, coating the limestone cliffs of the Jura in a treacherous glaze of ice. Aristhène forced the group upward, the horse's hooves sparking against the stone as it struggled to pull the travois. The whistle of the hunting hawk echoed again, closer this time, vibrating with a predatory confidence. Behind them, the torches of the Iron Hounds were no longer flickering stars in the valley. They were a rising tide of fire. "The horse is spent," Elias cried, his voice shrill with a mixture of terror and the lingering sting of Aristhène's grip. "Leave it! Leave the casket! We can climb the sheer face and vanish into the caves!" "The casket goes where I go," Aristhène growled, his boots slipping on a patch of black ice. He grabbed the harness, putting his own shoulder against the wooden frame to help the beast. "Move, or I will leave you for Valerius to explain why his tracking markers stopped here." A sudden, sharp twang cut through the howling wind. An iron-tipped bolt from a heavy arbalest hissed through the air, striking the stone inches from the horse's head. The animal reared in a blind panic, its eyes rolling back to show the whites. It shied away from the cliff's edge, lost its footing on the slick shale, and collapsed with a sickening crack of bone. The travois disintegrated. The lead-lined casket tumbled, gaining momentum as it bounced down a jagged rocky outcrop before wedging itself violently between two boulders. The sound of the impact was not the dull thud of wood, but the piercing scream of metal being torn. "No!" Aristhène leaped down the slope, sliding on his haunches, ignoring the stones tearing at his leather leggings. He reached the casket. The heavy lead plating had been peeled back like a fruit skin by a razor-sharp spur of rock. The interior wood had splintered, and for the first time in centuries, the interior was exposed to the gray, biting air of the world. Aristhène froze. He expected the glint of gold, the shimmer of jewels, or the thick, wax-sealed vellum of ancient royal deeds. Instead, a heavy cylindrical silver tube had rolled out of the wreckage, its cap knocked loose. From within, a single roll of papyrus, darkened by age and protected by a thin layer of bitumen-soaked linen, began to unfurl in the wind. Elias scrambled down behind him, his greed momentarily overriding his fear. "Is that it? Is that the treasure?" Aristhène reached out with trembling fingers. He
He was a man of high education, fluent in the Latin of the Church and the Greek of the East. As the wind caught the scroll, he saw the script. It was not the elegant calligraphy of a medieval monk. It was a hurried ancient Aramaic, accompanied by a parallel translation in the vulgar Latin of a first-century Roman administrator. He scanned the lines. He felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the sleet. The document was a report, a legal deposition from the Roman governor of Judea to the emperor in Rome. It wasn't a record of divinity or a hidden bloodline of kings. It was a ledger of a payoff. It detailed with cold bureaucratic precision how the Roman authorities had conspired with local factions to stage a disappearance, not a resurrection, but a political exile of a revolutionary to the far eastern borders of the empire to prevent a martyrdom that would have fueled a rebellion Rome couldn't afford. The foundation of the church, the miracle of the resurrection itself, was described in these lines as a successful Roman counterinsurgency operation. "It's a lie," Elias whispered, staring at the symbols he couldn't read but whose weight he could feel. "What does it say, Aristhène?" Aristhène didn't answer. His mind was a storm of fire. He realized in that moment why the Order had kept this in the Black Archive. It wasn't a weapon to be used against the Pope. It was a burden that had kept the Templars shackled to the Church. They weren't the Church's protectors. They were the keepers of the secret that could end it. If this reached the world, the faith that held the West together would shatter into 1,000,000 jagged shards of nihilism and blood. King Philip didn't want this to blackmail the Pope. He wanted it because if he held the proof that the Church was a Roman fiction, he became the only divine authority left. He would be God on earth. "It's the end of the world," Aristhène whispered. "Give it to me." Elias lunged for the scroll, his eyes bright with the realization of its value. "The king will give me a dukedom for this. We don't have to run anymore." Aristhène hand-batted the boy with the heavy leather of his glove, sending him sprawling into the slush. "This is not a prize, you fool. It is a plague." "Aristhène!" The voice boomed from the ridge above. Valerius stood there, silhouetted against the torchlight of 20 iron hounds. He held his long sword pointed toward the sky. Beside him, archers drew their bows, the strings humming with tension. "The horse is dead, and the box is broken," Valerius shouted, his voice ringing with a terrible triumph. "I see the silver in the snow. Don't die for a piece of paper, brother. Step away, and I will ensure the boy and the priest are given a quick end. The king only needs the knight and the word." Aristhène looked at the silver tube, then at the dying Father Bernard, who was watching him with wide, glassy eyes from the ridge above. He looked at Elias, who was weeping in the mud. For 20 years, Aristhène had fought for the cross. He had killed for it, bled for it, and watched his friends die for it. Now he held the proof that the cross was a shadow cast by a Roman quill. The irony was a physical weight, crushing his soul. He had 2 choices: surrender the truth to a tyrant who would use it to enslave the minds of men, or destroy the very thing he had spent his life protecting. With a roar of defiance that drowned out the wind, Aristhène snatched the scroll and shoved it back into the silver tube, slamming the cap home with the heel of his palm. "Move, or I will leave you for Valerius to explain why his tracking markers stopped here." He didn't flee. He didn't surrender. He turned towards the climb, the tube tucked into his belt, his sword drawn. "Valerius!" Aristhène screamed. "If you want the truth, you will have to find it in the heart of the mountain." He began to climb the sheer, ice-slicked face of the Jura, moving with a frantic, desperate strength. Behind him, Valerius gave the order. A volley of arrows hissed into the dark, and the hunt moved from the paths to the peaks. The midpoint had passed. The knight no longer served the Order or the Church. He served the silence.
The summit of the Jura was a landscape of jagged teeth and frozen sighs. The sleet had transitioned into a blinding, horizontal snow that erased the horizon, leaving Aristhène in a world of white and gray. He moved like a ghost through the drifts, his breath coming in jagged, crystalline bursts.
Behind him, the torches of the iron hounds had been extinguished by the gale, but their presence was felt in the rhythmic clatter of armor and the occasional shout of a commander trying to keep his line from shattering in the cold. Aristhène reached a narrow col, a high mountain pass that offered the only transit toward the western slopes. He stopped, his lungs screaming for oxygen, and looked back. Far below, a single persistent light remained, Valerius's lantern, swinging with the grim determination of a man who knew his quarry was trapped. "The boy is dead, isn't he?" The voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the howl of the wind. Aristhène turned to see Father Bernard slumped against a jagged pillar of frost-covered limestone. The priest's face was the color of old ash, his eyes sunken and glassy. He had been lashed to the last of our supplies, dragging himself upward through a miracle of agony. "Elias chose his path, Father," Aristhène said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "He is with the king's men now. Whether they let him live or leave him in the snow is no longer our concern." "He was just a child, seduced by the promise of a world that makes sense," Bernard coughed, a spray of dark frozen droplets hitting the snow. "And we are the monsters who carry the truth that breaks it." Aristhène reached into his belt and felt the cold silver weight of the tube, the chronicles of the Nazarene, the ledger of the Great Deception. He looked at the vast, uncaring peaks around him. Nature did not care for the divinity of kings or the resurrection of prophets. It only cared for the physics of the storm. "If we reach the other side," Aristhène said, kneeling beside the dying priest, "the path leads down to the foothills of the Saintonge. From there it is a 3-day ride to the coast. Even if the Templar fleet is burning, there are smugglers' coves near La Rochelle. A fishing cog can take us to the shadows of the Scottish Isles." "I will not see the sea again, Aristhène," Bernard said, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the silver tube. You must decide. If the world is a lie, is it a kind lie? Or is the truth, however cold, the only thing that can set us free?" Before Aristhène could answer, a shadow detached itself from the swirling snow. It was a hound, not a metaphorical one, but a massive black-furred mastiff, its eyes glowing with a feral hunger. It didn't bark, it lunged. Aristhène's instincts, honed by decades of warfare, took over. He drew his misericord and spun, catching the beast under the throat. The warm blood splashed over his frozen hands, steaming in the frigid air. He kicked the carcass away just as the first of the iron hounds emerged from the whiteout. They were not the polished soldiers of Paris. They were bedraggled, frostbitten, and desperate. They saw Aristhène not as a knight, but as the only obstacle between them and the warmth of the king's favor. "Yield!" one of them screamed, raising a heavy mace. Aristhène met him with the cold precision of the Templar's elite. He parried the mace, the vibration rattling his teeth, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him tumbling back into the abyss of the cliffside. Two more closed in, their swords clashing against Aristhène's desperate defense. The fight was a blur of steel and ice. Aristhène fought with a nihilistic fury. If the cross was a fiction, then he was no longer a servant of God. He was a force of nature. He fought for the silence of the mountain. He fought to ensure that the silver tube stayed buried in the white void. Suddenly, a heavy weight slammed into his back. He was driven to his knees. Valerius stood over him, his face a mask of frostbitten rage. He didn't use his sword, he used the iron pommel of his hilt, striking Aristhène across the temple. The world tilted. Aristhène fell into the snow, the taste of copper filling his mouth. Through a haze of pain, he saw Valerius reach down and tear the silver tube from his belt. "Finally," Valerius hissed, his breath of foul mist. He held the tube up to the flickering light of a newly lit torch. The remaining hounds gathered around, their faces illuminated by a hellish orange glow. They looked like ghouls gathered around a fresh kill. "Open it," one of the soldiers urged. "Let's see the gold that's worth 1,000 deaths." Valerius hesitated. He looked at Aristhène, who lay bleeding in the snow, and then at the dying Father Bernard. The wind seemed to drop for a heartbeat, creating a pocket of eerie silence. "This isn't gold," Valerius whispered, his voice trembling. He felt the ancient weight of the object. He unscrewed the cap. As the scroll began to unroll, the wind returned with a renewed demonic force. It snatched at the papyrus, threatening to tear the ancient fibers. Valerius shielded it with his cloak, his eyes darting across the Aramaic script and the Latin footnotes. He didn't speak. He didn't cheer. Slowly, the triumph drained from his face, replaced by a profound existential horror. He looked at the cross stitched on his own weathered surcoat, the symbol he had served even after betraying his brothers. He looked at the soldiers around him, men who had murdered and tortured in the name of a divine mandate. "What is it, Captain?" the mace-bearer asked, reaching out. "What does it say?" Valerius looked at the man, then back at the scroll. He saw the world as it truly was, a chaotic scramble for power built on a foundation of expertly managed myths. If he gave this to Nogaret, he would be rich, but he would be the architect of a world where nothing was sacred, not even the king he served. With a sudden, violent motion, Valerius didn't hand the scroll over. He thrust it into the heart of the torch held by his subordinate. "No!" the soldiers screamed, lunging forward. The ancient papyrus, dry as bone and soaked in bitumen, ignited instantly. It didn't just burn, it flared with a brilliant blue-white intensity that blinded everyone in the circle. The chronicles of the Nazarene, the secret that had survived a millennium in the dark, vanished into a cloud of acrid smoke in a matter of seconds. Valerius dropped the empty silver tube into the snow. He looked at Aristhène and gave a small, tragic nod. "The king wanted a ledger," Valerius said, his voice weary beyond measure. "I have given him an empty page." The soldiers, realizing their prize was gone, their gold, their pardons, their futures turned to ash, fell upon Valerius with a primal howl of betrayal. Aristhène watched through the crimson veil of his own blood as the iron hounds tore their dead captain apart in the snow. In the chaos, Aristhène crawled towards Father Bernard. The priest's eyes were closed. He was gone, his final breath spent in the silence of the Jura. Aristhène stood up, his body a map of pain. The hounds were busy with their dead captain, their discipline shattered by the loss of the archive. He turned away from the light, away from the fire, and began the long descent toward the western slopes. He had no order. He had no god. He had no secret. He was simply a man walking into the dark, carrying the weight of a silence that would last forever.
The sky over Paris was a bruised purple, choked by the thick, greasy soot of 100 chimneys and the encroaching winter damp. It had been 7 years since the Great Arrest, 7 years since Aristhène had vanished into the white silence of the Jura. Now he walked the streets of the capital not as a knight, but as a ghost in a pilgrim's rough wool, his face scarred by frost and steel, his identity buried deeper than the ruins of the temple. The city was a different place. The shadow of the king had grown long, and the grand fortress of the order had been converted into a royal treasury and a dungeon of size. In the center of the city, at the Ile de la Cité, the stage was being set for the final act of King Philip's long obsession. A massive wooden platform had been erected in the shadow of Notre Dame, and piles of faggots, dry, seasoned oak, were being stacked high by silent laborers. Aristhène stood in the back of the crowd, his hood pulled low. He watched as the heavy doors of the conciergerie creaked open. Out stumbled 4 men, their hair long and matted, their bodies broken by years of the rack and the question. At their head was Jacques de Molay. The Grand Master looked like a man already dead, a skeleton wrapped in translucent skin, yet his eyes burned with a terrifying, lucid clarity. "They have broken his body," a voice whispered beside Aristhène. It was a woman, her face etched with the weary piety of the Parisian poor. "They say he confessed to everything, the spitting, the idols, the denial of Christ." Aristhène didn't respond. He knew the truth of those confessions. He knew the weight of the iron boots and the slow pull of the pulleys. But more importantly, he knew that the archive was gone.
The secret that Philip had killed thousands to possess was now nothing but a memory in Aristhène's mind and a pile of ash in a mountain pass. The king's crier stepped forward, his voice booming over the restless murmur of the crowd. He read the long list of charges, the lurid crimes that had turned a kingdom against its defenders. De Molay stood silent through the reading, his gaze fixed on the spires of the cathedral. But as the crier reached the sentence, death by slow fire, de Molay suddenly straightened his back. The rattling of his chains was the only sound in the square. "I have lied." De Molay's voice was not the rasp of a dying man. It was the roar of the lion of the temple, carrying to the furthest edges of the square. "The crimes I confess to were false. The order is pure. My only sin is that I betrayed my brothers to save my own wretched life from the agony of the king's fire." A shockwave of silence rippled through the crowd. On the royal balcony, Guillaume de Nogaret leaned forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not the script. The public recantation was the one thing the king could not afford. Aristhène felt a surge of cold, sharp pride. Even without the archive, the Grand Master was striking a final blow. By dying as a martyr rather than a heretic, he was denying Philip the moral victory he craved. "Aristhène!" The whisper was close, right at his ear. Aristhène didn't turn his head, but his hand moved to the dagger hidden beneath his robes. "Do not reach for the blade, brother," the voice continued. It was soft, cultured, and carried the unmistakable accent of the royal court. "I have waited a long time for you to return to the scene of the crime." Aristhène slowly turned his head. Standing there, dressed in the fine silks of a courtier, was Elias. The boy was gone. In his place was a man with a cold, hollow face and eyes that had seen too much of the king's inner workings. He bore a jagged scar across his neck where Aristhène's grip had once crushed his throat. "You look well, Elias," Aristhène said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "The king's bread seems to agree with you." "I am the king's chief archivist now," Elias replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It is a position of great trust. Philip is still looking for the silver tube, Aristhène. He has men digging in the Jura even now, though they find nothing but frozen bones. He believes you have it. He believes you are the last key to his divinity." "He is digging for ghosts," Aristhène said. "The fire in the mountains took the archive. Valerius and I saw to that. Valerius is dead, and you are here. And if you are here, it is because you cannot let the Grand Master die without a witness. But look around, Aristhène. This isn't a trial. It's an execution of a legacy." Below them, the soldiers began to lead de Molay toward the pyre. The crowd began to jeer, egged on by royal provocateurs, but many were silent, their faces pale with the realization that they were watching the end of an era. "I can save you," Elias whispered, leaning closer. "The king doesn't want your death. He wants the word. If you give me the location of the true archive, because I know the mountain was a ruse, I can get you out of the city. I can even stop the fire for the Grand Master." Aristhène looked at the pyre, then at the man who had once been his brother. He realized that Elias truly believed there was more. The human mind could not accept that such a monumental secret had simply ceased to exist. "There is no other archive, Elias," Aristhène said, and for the first time in 7 years he felt a strange light peace. "The truth is, there is no truth left to guard. We are all just men standing in the dark, waiting for the fire." Elias's face hardened. He signaled to the shadows behind them. 4 men in the livery of the Iron Hounds stepped forward, their hands on their hilts. "Then you will join him," the king said. "The king will be disappointed, but the fire is a very effective teacher. As the guards moved in, Aristhène didn't fight. He looked past them toward the pyre. Jacques de Molay was being bound to the stake. The Grand Master looked directly into the crowd, his eyes meeting Aristhène's for a fleeting, eternal second. In that look there was no command, only a final, silent recognition. The torch was lowered to the oak. The flames licked upward, orange and hungry. "I summon you," de Molay's voice rang out over the crackle of the wood. "King Philip, Pope Clement, within a year I summon you both to appear before the judgment of God." The fire rose. Aristhène felt the heat on his face, the same heat that had consumed the scroll in the mountains. He allowed the guards to take his arms. He didn't care about the cells or the rack. He had seen the last of the Black Knights go into the light, and he knew that the silence he carried was the only thing that could never be burned.
The dungeons of the Palais de la Cité were not designed for the living, but for the slow unmaking of the soul. Aristhène sat in a cell where the walls wept a constant cold saltpeter, the stone floor his only companion. Above, the city whispered of the Grand Master's curse. Within a month of de Molay's execution, Pope Clement had perished in agony from a sudden flux of the bowels. The king, Philip the Fair, had become a man haunted by the shadows of his own palace, his handsome face turning into a mask of sallow paranoia. Elias entered the cell not with a torturer, but with a tray of wine and white bread, a psychological cruelty more refined than the rack. He looked at Aristhène, who remained seated in the filth, his eyes as steady as a predator's in the dark. "The king is dying, Aristhène," Elias said, his voice trembling with a secret terror. "He fell from his horse during a hunt, a freak occurrence. His legs are useless, and his mind is a labyrinth of Templar ghosts. He believes that if he can touch the archive, the curse will lift. He believes the truth can heal him." "The truth did not save de Molay," Aristhène replied, his voice a dry rasp. "Why should it save a man who built a throne out of his brother's bones?" "You are going to tell me where the true archive is," Elias hissed, leaning in. "I know the scroll in the mountains was a decoy. Valerius was a fool, but I am an archivist. I know that the Black Knights never put all their faith in a single vessel. There is a second repository, a Bastion. Tell me where it is, and I will let you walk out of this city tonight." Aristhène looked at the wine, then at Elias. He saw the desperation in his eyes. Elias wasn't just serving the king anymore. He was trying to save himself from the void. If the archive didn't exist, then everything Elias had done, the betrayal, the murders, the lies, was for nothing. He needed it to be real to justify his own damnation. "There is a fortress," Aristhène said slowly, watching Elias's pupils dilate with hope. "In the south, near the old Cathar lands of the Languedoc, a place where the sun never touches the floor of the valley. We call it the Mountain Bastion." "The coordinates," Elias demanded, pulling a piece of parchment from his sleeve. "I will take you there, but only you and a small escort. If the king's army marches on it, the keepers will burn everything before you reach the gate. You want the word, Elias, then you must come to the mountain as a seeker, not a conqueror." 3 days later, a small party slipped out of Paris under the cover of a freezing autumn mist. They traveled fast and light, bypassing the main roads. Elias, driven by a manic energy, barely slept. Aristhène rode in the center, his hands bound by a long silken cord to Elias's saddle, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was leading them toward the ruins of Père Pertus, a jagged skeletal fortress that clung to the limestone cliffs like a dying eagle. As they reached the base of the mountain, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed the screams of the Cathar martyrs who had died there a century before. The path was narrow, a ribbon of stone suspended over a 1,000-foot drop. "Is this it?" Elias asked, his voice cracking.
He looked up at the ruins, which seemed to grow out of the very rock. The entrance is through the lower cisterns. They dismounted, leaving the 4 iron hounds at the base of the final climb. Elias, clutching a torch, followed Aristhène into the dark, damp throat of the mountain. The air grew heavy, smelling of ancient dust and the metallic tang of iron. They reached a massive iron-bound door hidden behind a fall of scree. "Open it," Elias commanded, his hand on his dagger. Aristhène pressed his hand against a specific stone. With a groan of counterweights, the door swung inward. Elias rushed past him, his torch illuminating a vast vaulted chamber. But as the light filled the room, Elias stopped. The chamber was empty. There were no gold-lined caskets, no silver tubes, no ancient scrolls. Instead, the walls were covered in thousands of names carved in the stone with the painstaking precision of a mason. Names of knights, squires, cooks, and priests, the names of every Templar who had died since the arrests began. In the center of the room sat a single plain wooden bowl with ash. "Where is it?" Elias screamed, his voice echoing off the cold stone. "Where is the archive? Where are the records?" Aristhène walked to the center of the room. He looked at the names on the walls. He saw Thomas, whom he had killed in the chapel. He saw Bernard. He saw the boys Elias had traded for a title. "This is the archive, Elias," Aristhène said softly, his voice a dry rasp. "The memory of what we were. There are no scrolls. The Black Archive was never meant to be a weapon against the Church. It was a mirror. It showed us that we were guarding a vacuum, that the only thing sacred in this world is the blood we shed for one another." "You lied!" Elias lunged at him, but Aristhène was no longer the broken prisoner. He stepped inside the boy's guard, his hands moving with the lethal efficiency of the temple. He caught Elias's wrist and twisted, the dagger clattering to the floor. "I didn't lie," Aristhène whispered, pulling Elias close. "I brought you to the only truth that matters. You betrayed the living for the sake of the dead. Now you will stay here with them." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, silent and indifferent. Aristhène emerged from the mountain alone. He looked back at the ruins of Père Pertus, the mountain bastion of the dead. The iron hounds at the base of the cliff were gone, likely fled from the unnatural silence of the place. He began to walk south, toward the border of Aragon. He had no horse, no gold, and no order. But for the first time in his life, his heart was as light as the falling snow. The Black Knights were finished. The secret was buried in a mountain of ash, and the king's ledger was finally closed.
The blizzard that tore across the Languedoc was a white fury, a wall of ice that seemed intent on scouring the earth of its sins. Aristhène moved through the pass, his body a numb instrument of survival. He was no longer running, he was waiting. The mountain had claimed Elias, leaving the traitor to rot in the hollow tomb of his own greed, but the king's malice was not yet satiated. Behind Aristhène, emerging from the whiteout like hounds from the mouth of hell, were the last of Nogaret's iron hounds. These were the veterans, men who had seen the fires of the Holy Land and the wet blood of the Parisian gutters. Leading them was a man Aristhène had hoped never to see again, Captain Marceau. The man had survived the collapse of the Roman tunnel years ago, his face now a ruin of scar tissue and bitterness. He did not call for surrender. He did not offer the king's mercy. He simply raised a heavy black steel mace, and his men fanned out across the frozen ridge. "The boy is gone, knight." Marceau's voice was a jagged growl, barely audible over the wind. "The king is dead, or as good as, but Nogaret remains, and Nogaret wants your heart on a platter to show the new king that the shadows still belong to us." Aristhène drew his sword. The steel was notched and pitted, but it felt like an extension of his own scarred soul. He didn't take a defensive stance. He stepped forward, the snow swirling around his knees.
"The shadows belong to no one, Marceau," Aristhène replied. "They only wait to swallow those who stay in them too long." The combat was a visceral, grinding collision of iron and bone. There was no knightly grace here, no pageantry of the lists. It was a brawl at the edge of the world. Aristhène moved with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. He parried a spear thrust, the vibration singing through his frozen arms, and stepped inside the guard of the first soldier, driving his dagger into the throat of the man. The hot blood sprayed across the snow, steaming for a heartbeat before turning to ice. Marceau swung the mace with a terrifying rhythmic power. Every blow that Aristhène caught on his blade threatened to shatter the steel. They circled one another on a narrow ledge, the abyss yawning just feet away. The wind shrieked, a choir of ghosts cheering for the slaughter. "Where is the casket?" Marceau roared, his mace whistling through the air. "Where is the truth that burned the order?" "It is exactly where it belongs," Aristhène countered, his blade lashing out to catch Marceau across the thigh. "In the wind, in the ash, you are chasing a ghost, Marceau. There is nothing left to find." Marceau lunged, the weight of his armor carrying him forward like a falling boulder. He slammed into Aristhène, and the two men went down into the slush. They rolled toward the edge of the precipice, fingers clawing at eyes, teeth bared. Aristhène felt the mace come down on his shoulder, a sickening crack echoing in his ears. Pain, white and blinding, flared through his vision, but he did not let go. He reached for the silver tube, the empty vessel he had kept as a lure. As they teetered on the brink of the precipice, Aristhène shoved the tube into Marceau's hand. "Take it," Aristhène hissed, his face inches from the captain's. "Take your prize to Nogaret. Tell him it's the word of God." In that moment of greed, Marceau's grip on his mace loosened. He looked down at the silver cylinder, his eyes widening with a dying man's hope. Aristhène didn't hesitate. He planted both feet in Marceau's chest and shoved with every ounce of strength remaining in his broken body. Marceau didn't scream. He fell backward, his hand still clutching the empty silver tube, disappearing into the white void of the blizzard. The sound of his body hitting the rocks far below was swallowed by the storm. Aristhène lay on the ledge, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked at his hands. They were empty. The archive was gone. The hunters were dead or fled. The secret was finally, irrevocably silent. He closed his eyes, the cold no longer a bite, but a gentle, heavy blanket. He had reached the climax of his long, dark road. He was the last Black Knight, and he was finally alone.
The year 1314 ended not with a bang of divine intervention, but with the quiet, rhythmic thud of a spade hitting Scottish peat. The air here, on the edge of the world in Midlothian, was damp and carried the scent of salt from the Firth of Forth. It was a cleaner cold than the frozen heights of the Jura or the soot-choked alleys of Paris. Here, the hills were green even in winter, and the shadows were cast by ancient stones that did not care for the politics of kings. Sir Aristhène, now known simply as the Frenchman to the locals of Roslin, moved with a heavy, permanent limp. His shoulder had never set right after the fight with Marceau, and his face was a map of white lines where the frost and steel had left their mark. He wore the rough homespun of a laborer, his hands calloused from the work of a mason rather than a warrior. He was standing in the foundation of a small private chapel being built by the Sinclair family, descendants of a lineage that had long kept a quiet, sympathetic eye on the wandering remnants of the order. The Sinclairs did not ask for his name, and he did not offer his history. In this corner of the world, a man's silence was his most respected possession. Aristhène reached into his tunic and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was not a scroll, nor a silver tube, but a handful of ash and a single obsidian ring, the mark of the Black Knights. He knelt in the center of the nave, beneath where the great pillar would one day stand. "Dust to dust," he whispered.
He poured the ash into the foundation and dropped the ring on top of it. He watched as the gray powder vanished into the dark earth. This was the final burial of the archive. The documents were gone, the men were dead, and the secret of the great deception was now nothing more than a ghost of a memory. He had come to realize that the truth he had carried, the record of a Roman conspiracy to fashion a faith, was no longer a threat, because it no longer mattered. The world had moved on. The faith had outgrown its foundation. Men were already building new cathedrals and fighting new wars in the name of the cross, oblivious to the ink and parchment of the past. The king, Philip IV, was dead, just as de Molay had summoned. He had died of a stroke following a hunting accident, his final days spent in a feverish terror of the ghosts he had created. Nogaret, too, was gone, his brilliant, cold mind silenced by a sudden illness. The iron hounds had scattered like ash in the wind. The Great Purge had succeeded in destroying the order, but it had failed to capture the soul of the Black Knights. "Frenchmen, the mortar's ready." The call came from a young apprentice across the site. Aristhène stood up, wiping the dirt from his knees. He picked up his trowel and returned to the stone. He was no longer a knight of Christ or a guardian of the Veritatum. He was a man building a wall. As the years passed, the chapel at Roslin grew. Aristhène worked on it until his hands could no longer hold the chisel. He carved symbols into the stone that only a brother would recognize, subtle nods to the temple, to the mountains, and to the silence. He didn't carve them to preserve a secret, but to honor the men who had died in the dark. He wanted the stone to remember what the world would inevitably forget. On his final day, sitting on a bench overlooking the valley as the sun dipped below the Scottish Highlands, Aristhène looked at his hands. They were steady. He felt no regret for the destruction of the archive. He understood now that some truths are too heavy for the world to bear, and that the greatest service a knight can perform is not to defend the light, but to stand guard over the darkness. The order of the temple was a ruin. The Black Knights were a myth, but the silence, the deep, cold silence of the secret, was eternal. Aristhène closed his eyes. The wind from the firth brushed against his face, smelling of the sea and the future. He breathed in once, a long, deep draught of the cold air, and then, for the first time in his life, he let go. The sun set over the chapel, casting long, jagged shadows across the hills. The archive was gone. The night was at rest. The world continued its slow, beautiful, and treacherous turn, blissfully unaware of the fire that had almost consumed its soul. The story of the Black Knights and the hidden fall of the Templars concludes not with a revelation, but with the necessity of a lie. By destroying the evidence that would have dismantled the moral authority of the West, Aristhène chooses the stability of civilization over the chaos of a devastating truth. The hidden fall refers not just to the arrest of the knights, but to the internal collapse of their belief system, and the final heroic act of erasing their own history to save a world that had betrayed them.